Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we truly have a very remarkable guest calling us all the way from France. It's Nikki, who writes under the name N.L. Holmes, who is not just an author of some wonderful historical fiction, but also a former archaeologist and a former nun who's done excavations in Greece and Israel. Yep, I described you as Indiana Jones earlier. So, Nikki, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Comment ça va?
Ça va bien. It's hot cool after a very hot spell.
Absolutely. Well, it is delightful to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland, and thanks for joining us, Nikki. Yeah, you know, your story is fascinating. So I mean, obviously we want to start with that in terms of you were a nun, and then you went and you became an archaeologist, and then you became a writer. And I mean, the path to that is, I'm sure, not a straight one. So it'd be interesting to hear how one does that, because, you know, there's a lot of aspects of our lives that inform our writing. And I think when you have something so varied, you can really end up with a lot in your books. And the idea of being an archaeologist is going to help you write novels if you're writing about historical type things, which you often do. So why don't you tell us a bit about how that sort of path went and led you to writing, and then how it sort of informs your writing, and then, you know, we'll go from there.
Well, I had always wanted to be an archaeologist since I was a small child. I guess since I found out what an archaeologist was. So I collected pennies to save Abu Simbel and all of this sort of thing as a kid. I began university. I was in the honors program, so I didn't actually major in archaeology, but I was taking classes in that direction. And then I mysteriously left university after a year and a half and went into the antiques business in my hometown. And after about 2 years, I felt the calling to do something more meaningful with my life. This was in the 60s, of course, and so, you know, a lot of my generation were giving themselves to greater causes in one sort or another. A lot of my friends went into ashrams and things like this, so it was, I guess the convent wasn't too wild a choice. But this was a cloistered order, Discalced Carmelites, and I was there for nearly 20 years.
Wow.
And then as soon as I left, I re-enrolled in university and went back and finished up my degree and went on for a PhD. And then I taught history and humanities and archaeology for 25 years or so, with an occasional sidestep into interior decorating and being a administrative assistant for an educational foundation and some other things. And then when I retired, it just seemed like a natural step to use the information I had amassed and so many great stories I'd come across, you know, in my research or in my class, just to turn them into fiction. And I think my motive as an author has been the same as my motive in the classroom, and that is to sort of convince people of the humanity of those who went before us, that they were humans like us with the same emotions and everything.
You know, I find that so interesting, because one of the things I think when we look at the past is sometimes there are horrific things done in the past, and sometimes horrific things done by great people. Like we look at Thomas Jefferson, one of the fathers of this country, who wrote all men are created equal when he owned more slaves than any other former president.
Yeah, it's unfortunately they're men of their times. You know, you can't make them live by our mores, and when they had something else floating around in the air. So the same is true for the Egyptians, or, you know, any other ancient people. They were pagans, but they could be good or bad according to their own lights. So got to take them as they are.
And I think also, I mean, one of the interesting things, one of your books is called The Queen's Dog, and the main character is a eunuch, of course, which is such an interesting thing to throw in there, because that's something that obviously in our modern day, I guess we don't think we we have as a cultural awareness. But yeah, that was a unique perspective.
Yes, and that could sort of stand in for any marginalized group. I mean, they were castrated by people who wanted them that way, and yet they were made fun of and treated badly and everything, as if it were their fault somehow. So I think you could apply that to people who can't help the color of their skin, or what their accent or whatever. So I felt it was topical, even though it was something which more or less has faded out in the world. I understand there are some in certain countries which will remain unnamed.
Yeah, I mean, it makes more sense too when you're writing historical books that you pull in something like that. But I like the idea that you can use a marginalized group that makes sense for your story, but it will apply to other marginalized groups. And
yeah,
I think that's something that writers do a lot, and it's always good to make sure that you're doing it in the correct way for what you're writing. So what were you writing? Like, what were the kind of books that you wrote? And I'm not sure, like, when you did your archaeology, were you hands-on at all? Like, I mean, we're not saying were you Indiana Jones, but were you Indiana Jones?
There is no Indiana Jones.
All right, no, that's the first in my bubble.
Break it to you. I
you
did
went out in the field.
a couple, a few times, and then when our son was born, that stopped. But yeah, that was a wonderful experience. I think that's one of the things that attracted me to archaeology rather than, say, ancient languages or history straight up, because it's very hands-on. You're working in the field, often in difficult conditions, in a small group of foreigners in another country, and it's very intimate. You get to know people really well in a way that I think scholars don't ordinarily get to know each other. You make very deep relationships that way too.
I mean, it's not really, I guess, maybe relevant to the writing process, but I'm wondering,
Yeah.
When you're an archaeologist and something is found, okay, so I don't know. I guess there's two paths. You're the person who somehow finds it, or you're maybe part of a team that has to uncover it when it is found, right? So how does that work? I think of the only time I think about it is I was more a paleontologist, I guess, now that I'm thinking about where they're sitting around digging out the bones. But if it's not that, how does that work? Are you pulled in? Oh, we found this, this relic.
Yes, it becomes a communal effort. Whoever finds it, there's a team actually in the trench, and the director is usually prowling around from trench to trench, and he'll go over there and see. And of course, it has to be very carefully noted where it's found and what is found on the same level with it, and then it will be scrupulously removed from the dirt and taken back to a dig house of some sort. And when I was working in Crete, I was the manager of the dig house, so I saw everything that came out of the ground, and it was really a great spot to be. And we would catalog it, and photograph it, draw it, reconstruct it if it was pottery or something, and then hand it out to the experts in one field or another to take a deeper look. But ultimately, it was the responsibility of the director of the excavation to make sense of that find, to insert it into its context when the report was written up.
So you have to really understand the area that you're in. You probably have to do a lot of reading about that area, a lot of study about that area.
And of course, you do have experts in various fields like pottery or bones or whatever, but still, it's a discipline that requires a very broad knowledge of the culture you're working in. And that was one of the things that I liked, because I didn't want to have to make a choice and concentrate on the language or, on pollen grains that were found here and there. I wanted to study the culture in the broader sense and sort of in the macro focus, just because that's what I liked, from childhood on. So I never really specialized in a way that a good many people do.
Right. That's better.
It was better for me, for sure.
I have a very weird question. So one of my favorite books about writing is Stephen King's On Writing, and he's a discovery writer. You know, I guess we used to call them pantsters, but now they're called discovery writers. And he used to have this. He used to use this metaphor, like when you are creating a story, it's like you are excavating something from the ground and you're dusting away the skeleton and stuff like that. So do you think that's an analogy that actually works? Is that how you approach writing? Are you a discovery writer?
Yes, I am. And I'll say it proudly, I'm a pantser. But no, King had a good metaphor going there. It is, or, you know, they often speak of sculptors discovering the figure inside the marble or something. It's you start blind and work your way in and find what's there. And it's the characters that lead you and their reactions to things. So yeah, that's very much how I proceed. And even though I've been writing mysteries for a while now, I never know until the very end who done it, which sounds like a certain slackness and control, perhaps, but at least it's a surprise.
I mean, you're a discovery writer, so I guess you discover it, and in some ways, maybe that's I know lots of mystery authors who plan everything out and they start from the ending and work their way back. But it's like in some ways, it's kind of if you were excited writing it, then maybe that covers over that people get excited when they're reading it to discover.
I hope so. I mean, for sure, there's a moment of angst there at the very end when you're trying to wrap things up and you still don't know who did it, you know, so.
Okay, so I imagine at that point, unless, I mean, maybe you're far better than I could ever be. I imagine at that point when you decide who it is, you've got to go back a little bit into the book and add in a few breadcrumbs,
Right.
You know,
you do that, and it requires you to reread the text a lot. So it's probably not an efficient method, but I tried my first book to write it, planning everything in advance and outlining and all this, and I thought I would die. I came to the conclusion I had no imagination and could never write. And the minute I stopped trying to force myself into that method, everything went fine.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was an awful experience.
So you're, I guess, with your experience, you find that your imagination is sparked by simply writing as opposed to trying to envision everything as a whole.
Exactly. I would stare at this outline that I was trying to create, and I couldn't think of anything, you know? It was just, it was very depressing. I'm so glad we're not, you know, this is the way books tell you to start. Get everything under control from the beginning and do this at 0.20% and this at 0.50%. And just, I cannot do that. And I'm not saying it proudly, but that's a fact.
Listen, everybody's got their own method.
Yeah. I go for the personal method myself.
I think that's right. I mean, when you put it like that, when it's like, oh, you've got to go 20% here, it almost sounds like it's AI assembling a book rather than you actually just writing and flowing.
Yeah, it was very, very painful.
Yeah, but it's also reminds me, and this is actually one of the reasons why I never followed these as well. But I know Roland is a big proponent of things like the story circle or whatever, which I found they're very rigid. Like, and then I'm not very good even at taking a book and then trying to figure out which point each thing happened. You know, some people can say, oh, well, that's the I don't really remember all the stages, but like, that's this stage and that's the stage. And I'm like, when I'm writing, I'm not thinking to myself, oh, I need to raise the stakes, or now I need to lower, so yeah, I understand from that perspective for sure. How do you feel? So I guess that means you sit down with just a kernel of an idea and taken from your archaeology history of things, of personal things that happened. Is that how it works?
Yes, most of my books have been based on real historical events, or at least real events are embedded in them. The books set in the Hittite Empire are almost purely historical. And the characters are all historical figures about whom we actually know nothing. So I, create them fictionally, but at least I know what they are and where they fit into the story. The later books, the Egyptian books, have progressively gotten away from historicity. I'm not violating any, but I'm not sticking to historical facts. So the Lord Hani mysteries, there was a real historical arc, and that was the coming to power and then the death and post-reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. And that gave me kind of the opportunity to bring in a lot of political intrigue and sort of anguish of conscience for the characters and things like that. But then the most recent series are cozy mysteries, and they're set in a historical moment, of course, but there isn't so much real political intrigue involved. This is a young woman physician who is kind of solving mysteries in her spare time. So it's, she's not a part of that world very much. Her father is, so occasionally they cross paths with that sort of stuff. But by and large, it's your typical whodunit. And so that's more left to my imagination than usual. But this is a formulaic genre, so it's not so terrible.
And then, is that the stuff that you always read was mystery or historical mystery, or is that just something that when you wanted to write because it sort of fit within, your background, that you decided that you would write? Like when I started writing romance, and I never even until I started writing it, I was never even reading it. Right. But that was what was selling well, and I wanted to try to, make a living selling books. So I chose that genre. So it meant, having to learn sort of how that genre works and everything. But it would have been easier if I had started writing science fiction or fantasy, because that's what I grew up reading. But those books, I didn't think I could churn those books out quickly or find as big of an audience. It's a smaller and pickier audience than romance was at the time. So that was sort of how I made, my decision on where to go. But it sounds like for you, it's probably a lot more personal in terms of what you've been doing. But is it also sort of what you were reading as well?
Yes, I've always liked historical fiction a lot. And there was kind of a golden age in the 50s and 60s with, Anya Seton and Rosemary Sutcliffe and Marguerite Yourcenar. And these were not only good, well-researched historical books, but very well-written literature, So this was kind of the golden fruit hanging out in front of me. Can you live up to this precedent? There are some really good historical books now. I guess but I read books from all periods, not just antiquity. Because I just like the insights into the past that fiction can give us. And I think that's intriguing. So yeah, that was one of many favored genres. I also like fantasy and science fiction too. And I've often thought there's not that much difference between fantasy and historical fiction, because there's a lot of world building in both cases. And, at some point I may slip into a fantasy.
I find that very true. I read history at university, and so that means when there were books like Game of Thrones, I gave Game of Thrones a try, and then I was like, you know what? If I'm going to learn all the kings and queens of the country, I want them to be the real kings and queens, because that might actually be useful for me at some point. And also the other thing, I don't know how you feel about this, but when you're writing fantasy, Game of Thrones is very much crushing the skulls of babies, and everyone is getting forced to do terrible things. And it's like, I understand those things happened in history. One of the things about fantasy is you can take what parts of history you want, and you can leave out the parts you don't want. So it says something about you as an author when you take those parts and you put them in. So that's why I kind of moved away from fantasy and like history.
Yeah, I understand. And I think my books started out rawer and they were more psychological dramas, the first 5 or 6 that I wrote. And there were some pretty horrible things happening in them. I mean, when the Assyrians take over your city and deport you, life is not pleasant. So, it was really painful to write these books, one in particular, which to live inside the head of a person who was just in a terrible situation, and an angry, damaged person on top of that was no fun. And gradually I moved away from that because it was not a good place for me to have to be. And so, for my Hani series, I developed a protagonist that I felt really was kind of the man I wanted to have for my father and my husband and everything else. So being inside the head of a good, principled person like this was a better place to be. And then, it's gotten lighter and lighter with time. I don't know how you explain that, but it's not fun to live in those terrible situations with violence and malice all around you.
But I do feel that, in some ways, like there are things going on in the world right now that some of us might not particularly appreciate. And one of the things we can do, you can go and protest, you can go into politics, or you can create art. And you can create that is your ability to tell the truth about what's going on and with the world. And I think that there are so many pieces of books and films that people have created that are in some ways relics of their time. Like Star Wars was an allegory for the Vietnam War, and it's like now Star Wars still has relevance and resonates with us because what they were struggling against then we're struggling against now. And I think it's
I agree completely. And a lot of my books were written at moments that they were very relevant commentaries. For example, the book about the conquest by the Assyrians. I mean, it was about Syrian refugees, and that was at the moment when refugees were pouring out of Syria. And
absolutely.
And I didn't set out to make a commentary on the modern politics, but you can't avoid it, And the Lord Hani mysteries altogether had a very heavy sort of conscientious understory there. He was a diplomat in the service of a man, a bad king, a man who was doing bad things to the country and was of questionable sincerity. And so how do you deal with that? Do you honor your oath to serve the king, or do you rebel in the name of conscience? And especially when it strikes your religion. This was a very hard decision for him and all the other characters who were government servants at that time. So this was something, and you can't avoid this sort of thing if you watch the news. It's always in your head. And when you think of drama and human conflict, that's got to come into it. So I think many of my books, perhaps not this light series, but others could be taken as not allegories exactly, but commentaries on various modern political or conscientious issues.
And I think they are very important. What sort of books did you read growing up? Because like I read the Saint books by Leslie Charteris, and I always think one of the reasons I have certain attitudes towards certain things is because those books led me in that direction. What books did you read, and how did they influence you?
I read anything I could get my hands on. I'd visit the bookmobile that came around to our suburban area there and just check out anything I could find. So it would be hard to find a thread that early in my life. I read everything. And I also read things that were way above my level. And, that taught me vocabulary and grammar and writing and everything else. It was, I may not have gotten everything out of it, but I got enough to keep me doing it. It was, it was sufficiently interesting to me that I would often go back. I'd reread books that I liked 8 or 10 times. A lot of fantasy and science fiction, and this is in the 50s, particularly science fiction, but also historical books, nonfiction even, and stories about kids who had great adventures and, Robinson Crusoe and people on steamships crossing the world, and I mean adventure, a lot of that.
The Hardy Boys, that was one that I
That
started.
and Nancy Drew both, yeah,
Nancy
equal
Drew,
opportunity.
Yeah. Nancy Drew, did she come after? Like or maybe my parents were just very, you're a boy, you read Hardy Boys.
Yeah,
because all I had were Hardy Boys.
20s too.
She was okay. Same around the same time. Yeah.
And interestingly, my parents were always recommending books for me to read that they had read when they were kids. So I took on a lot of these books written in the teens and 20s. The Howard Pyle books and things that were illustrated by Wyeth and Rackham and stuff. Just I was a voracious reader, always reading.
That's so important for authors. I don't think I personally, I think it's a lot of people do go to school for writing. In fact, when I originally went to university, it was for writing, but I ended up switching out of the program. But I really feel like if you want to be a writer, there's no substitute for just reading a lot. As long as you read a lot, you can become a writer. I don't think you need to study it necessarily. It's my personal opinion. But
yeah, I agree completely. And I'm speaking now as a person who did not study writing. So,
right.
You read books and you go to conferences and watch podcasts and stuff. But ultimately, as you say, it's the lessons you've learned from your own reading, because you have to put yourself in the position of a reader in order to create something people are going to want to pick up and keep up with. So, no, that's the track as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. And I think I think it's interesting. What you guys were talking about. Roland was saying about the history that that when he watched Game of Thrones and was thinking about, I'd want to learn about real history, but I think a lot of it is pulled from real history, and based on, and then you take that idea, you take the whatever empire from our past, and you pull out some of those, and then you just put them in space or on another planet or in a medieval setting and call them something else, and then all of a sudden you are able to sort of start with but adding in going away from the historical facts allows you to make them a little bit more interesting, because I'm sure not all. I think when we look at history, we hear the highlights, but and which can be very interesting if you pick out all those like things that happened and say, wow, history is interesting. But when you dig into the nitty gritty, it's usually those highlights are probably the most interesting things that happen, but leading up to them weren't so great. Going away from them. So when you can take those highlights and sort of put them in your book, but then do what you want with them, it makes it much more interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, for one thing, it's the human element that's sort of missing from the dates and battles and stuff like that. And I know as a teacher, that's what people are interested in, really. They want to know how they lived and what kind of person they were. And we don't always have historical answers to those questions, but a fiction writer can provide them.
Right. Exactly.
What a great way of putting it.
Well, it's one specific example that very recent for me. I remember that Roland back in, I think in a podcast, I have a terrible memory, right? So I know, but he had mentioned the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the movie. And I had added it to my list of things to watch. And this was many months ago. And so I totally even forgot that he was the one I think I remembered he was the one who recommended it, but nothing else about it. And then I watched it. And as I was watching, I'm like, I wonder if this is based on real events, because I'm not a history person. So I'm looking it up that's the beauty of modern times, right? We sit there watching a movie with our phone and looking everything up about it. So I'm like, these are all, based on real events. And they had Ian Fleming in there. And then I realized, because Roland's a big James Bond fan. So I was like, okay, now I remember why he mentioned about this book, is that Ian Fleming was in it, and then he had based one of the characters in this historically based movie. James Bond was based on it, so that all made sense again. But when I was reading about it, I was trying to say, okay, wow, this is a really exciting story, and it is based on a true story, but it is embellished, right? And they don't really know how it all went down in terms of the nitty gritty. So it probably was not as crazy and amazing and action packed as it was on the film, right? But it doesn't mean that, you know, the core events weren't real. And I think that's the beauty that the writers add to that, is they make history interesting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And while I've sort of drawn the line for myself, I will not contradict any known fact, although I've done it. I fudged a couple, but I've told people in my historical notes. I feel perfectly free to embroider, you know, anything we don't know, and the further back in time you go, the more we don't know. So it's pretty wide open. You have to try to be plausible, but and not, you know, create anachronisms. But still, I think that can draw people in and give them a better sense of what really happened than some disembodied list of dates. At least that was my discovery as a teacher.
Yeah.
I find that such an interesting thing. That particular raid you're talking about in Ministry of Gentlemanly Warfare, there were explosions and gunfire and that. The real thing, not a shot was fired. But there we go. That would have made for a very boring movie.
I didn't even know that. That's hilarious. I was looking up the gun that they were using. I'm like, that's not a real gun, because it seemed like a modern like machine gun, and it was silenced. But like, I didn't even realize that not a single shot was fired. That makes it even funny. But you're right, because I'm not a history person, because my experience with history living in Canada is Canada's history is really boring, right? I mean, there's maybe a few things once in a while that happened, but like, we learned about our prime ministers and the founding, but our country's not old enough to be interesting, right? We missed all the good times. And so,
and you're too nice to be
right. Like, it's so boring. And so I never got into history, because, you know, in Canada we learned about Canadian history, and this is just, there was dates, and our tests were when did the founding of, you know, like, I don't know, it doesn't matter. And I have a bad memory, so that I'm not going to remember that stuff anyways. But like, if our history had been, you know, knights and you know, like the kind of medieval stuff that we read in fantasy, then I probably would have been much more interested.
Sure.
And so I think that is really an important thing, is that authors can sort of get us interested in history by sprucing it up a bit. You know, we can see, because it did make me interested. Like, I went and I looked it up and I read stuff about it. Obviously not enough, because I didn't read that not a shot was fired. But but I love the angle of, you know, that Ian Fleming was part of the planning of it, and then that made him think, oh, well, I'll make this James Bond character who was sort of similar in some ways to that, you know, like, all that stuff really interested me. And I think we could probably get people more interested in history if the teachers took a page out of what authors do with history in this.
I totally agree. And I think the word there, the key word, is humanize it.
I think that's very true, because when we look at history, it's like the king did this, the queen did this, they moved the army here. Whereas real history, I mean, we are all three of us right now, we are living our unique history. We are living the same point in history, but you're living it in France, I'm living it in America, Craig is living it in Canada. And so our exposure to it is a human story. And I find that's really the power of fiction. It makes you suddenly care about things. And
and you know, if you listen to the news for very long these days, you realize that the decisions political leaders make are determined by the kind of person they are. And so it's not in vain that you try to figure out what kind of person they are. You know, this explains their decisions and their actions. And we have less to go on for people who lived thousands of years in the past, but it's not nothing what we know. We know how they acted. And so you can create the kind of person who would have acted that way, you know, and then it makes sense to people what they did.
And I think sometimes the thing that is so strange about history is you could meet somebody who was part of like the bad side, who actually turns out to be a nice person. I used to be a bartender in America, and one day this chap comes in and he immediately like clocks me because of the way I look at the way I speak in America. And he was from Zimbabwe, the former Rhodesia, and fought in the Bush Wars and things. And it's like, wow, that's a moment in history where, you know, there are people who are like the bad guys, but he was a very nice, charming, respectful person. And it's kind of like there's that dichotomy. And when you meet human beings, you realize that human beings aren't always all bad or all good.
No human being is all bad or all good. And that's one of the great riches that a fiction writer needs to tap and is happy to tap, because, you know, if you create a villain who is just pure evil, they don't exist. I mean, it may be the devil, but no human being. And likewise, you know, you don't want some goody two-shoes who's just sweetness and light. I mean, they have to have a little rough spot in them someplace, or they're not a human being. So it's that, what shall we say, that irony that even good people can do bad things, or bad people can do good things, that I try to exploit in my mysteries, and undoubtedly other authors do too.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we talk about a lot, is like everyone's a hero of their own story, right? And so the villain is never thinking to himself, I'm just doing things because I'm a bad guy. He's, you know, he has a reason. Maybe it's to get rich, and it's not a great reason, but you know, they do have a reason. And maybe, you know, they're not necessarily trying. They think they're gonna do good a lot of times, especially leaders. Like some of them are oppressive people, but often they're doing it in response to what they feel they were repressed, and they're getting back at their, you know, it's revenge, or it's, you know, so there is, you can't write a character and not give a backstory. Otherwise it's unsatisfying.
Right. And I think it's significant that the villains are often the most interesting characters in a novel, and children often identify with the villain, which, you know, it's kind of interesting, but I think they, having been told bad boy all the time, can figre out, well, here's another.
Well, I think as somebody who studies psychology, that's where I went after after I did my brief, you know, starting as writing, and then I switched to psychology. And I'm certainly not a psychologist, but my feeling on that is probably, you know, kids are driven by their own id, right? They are driven by, like, I want this, I want that. It's not until later that and so they can empathize with a villain who's basically, I want this, I want that, because they're probably like, yeah, why don't we do that? Why don't we just take
cynical, but easy to understand.
And then, you know, hopefully they grow up and they realize that that's not how society works. So, but yeah, I think knowing all this stuff in history is really, really important. Like we always say, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? And so I think we do a service almost to people by taking these stories and telling them in a way that that is more easily digestible than a history textbook, and teaching people, okay, you know, this is why this particular thing happened, or this is why we don't act this way, because this is what happened when we did in the past, right? So I think, you know, pulling all that in is really, really beneficial to people, to no matter how you get them.
I agree completely. In fact, I write a monthly blog for the Florida Writers Association, and one of my recent ones was what is the value of fiction, you know, in general, and not just historical. And people answered and said, "Oh, thank you for saying this. I get dark moments when I wonder if I'm just writing stories has any meaning or any utility." And I think it clearly does for that reason, but also just in terms of exercising your emotions, feeling pity and fear and a sense of right and wrong. I'm convinced, and someone corroborated this, that people who read, you know, just anything, fiction, have more compassion for others, and that's because they've been in their head, I suppose, and seen their motivation, seen what they've gone through that to bring them to this spot. And I think that's eminently worthwhile, maybe the most worthwhile thing we could do to contribute to the cooling of the climate here, not the physical climate, but the political climate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think if it teaches empathy, if it teaches like
Mhm.
the ability to see things from someone else's eyes,
Yeah.
then there's a lot of value in it. And that doesn't mean, just because you understand the motivations of someone doesn't mean you necessarily excuse those motivations. They're the bad guy, right? They do something horrible and you're like, oh, I get why they did it, but that doesn't make it right.
Yeah,
They could have gone another way.
right.
And that is hopefully what people take out of it. It's like, okay, this person didn't do all these things just because to be evil. They were damaged, or they were, they came from this situation. But the hero is showing them that they could have fixed their problem another way, other than killing everybody or taking over.
Yeah, and in the end, justice is done. The murderer is captured and imprisoned, and it gives you a kind of an upbeat sense of the world that you might not get from reading the news. That there is right, and it will triumph. Perhaps that's fatuous to believe, but I think it helps us get through the day.
I can't remember who said it, but there was an author who said the point of writing fantasy is not to write about dragons existing, but to write about the fact that they can be defeated.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
So we are coming up to the top of the hour. So before we sort of wrap things up and ask you to tell all our listeners and where they can actually find your books and things, I was just going to say, if you are, if there is somebody listening to this or watching this who I don't know, feels inspired to write their own historical fiction that perhaps is relevant to the modern age, what advice do you have for them? What encouragement do you have for them?
Well, I encourage them, because we can use as much of this as we can get. But in terms of preparing for it, research the bejabbers out of your period, know everything about it, whether you use it in your book or not. Kind of live in it mentally for a long time before you put pen to paper, and then jump in. And you don't have to have all your research done before you start. Just launch in, and then bring more detail in later. Do specialized research as you need to, and don't necessarily go looking for themes. Some people work that way, but I have never done it. So the themes will emerge if you yourself are a child of your times and know what's going on. They're up there in your subconscious, and they'll emerge. Just deal with your characters and let them guide you through the plot, and I think the parallels will happen.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Oh, well, Craig, do you have any final questions?
No, I think this has been a really interesting talk about sort of the benefits of adding history to your books, because there seems like there are so many reasons to do it, and it doesn't even matter the genre. Sometimes you think, oh well, I have to be writing a historical novel to be able to add history, but that's not the case, right? You can take those moments from history and just use those in your story, and some people will pick up on them and some people won't, but it'll still give you sort of that starting point of reality of this is actually how people did do things, right? And you put them in a different setting, and then all of a sudden you have a fantasy or sci-fi book. So yeah, I think it's very very helpful to think about these sort of things. So thanks for coming on and sharing with us.
My pleasure. It's been loads of fun.
Now, where can everybody find your books, Nikki?
They're available at all the usual online booksellers, plus, I suppose, brick and mortar stores here and there. I couldn't tell you where those were. But you can also approach them, learn more about them through my website, which will give you links to Amazon and a few of those places. And that is www.nlholmes.com.
That is wonderful. Well, we will make sure to pop a link right to that website down in the description. So if you are listening or watching on YouTube, if you enjoyed everything Nikki has had to share with us today, why don't you scroll down there, click on that link, and go and check out her books. And my recommendation is The Queen's Dog. That's got a very interesting idea to it. And while you're down there, there's that big empty comment section. So why don't you leave Nikki a comment and let her know how much you've appreciated what she has shared with us today. We always appreciate your comments. And finally, there's that like button, the subscribe button, and even a little bell icon. You can click on that and get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked, which of course there will be next week. So until then, cheerio.